mind when someone mentions the word prostitution? A dark street, a woman in a skimpy outfit, struck out on drugs, and trying to make enough money to please her pimp so he won't be able to abuse her. But there is also another side of prostitution, a side that not many people know that consists of high-end call girls, beautifully dressed escorts, and highly sought-after women in Japan who are treated respectfully and with dignity. What if the United States could find a happy medium between these two extremes? First, let's consider the history and background of prostitution. Prostitution is often referred to as the world's oldest profession, dating all the way back to 3 BC. Prostitution is also the world's fastest growing criminal enterprise, meaning that it makes more money than selling drugs or guns on the streets. Prostitution happens all around us, whether we know it or not. And according to the advocates at the Network Against Human Trafficking, there are more than 70,000 people arrested in the U.S. each year. As a family studies student, this topic was often discussed, and I became deeply interested in the topic and how much of a difference it would make if we decriminalized prostitution. Throughout extensive research that I have done, I have gained a greater amount of knowledge of this topic and the pros and cons for decriminalizing it. The United States would benefit socially and economically from decriminalizing prostitution throughout the country. First, I will discuss the problems that are associated with the current laws that are in place and criminalize prostitution. Most of the violence associated with sex workers is caused because it is illegal. This is because violent people are more likely to prey on sex workers, confident that they won't be reported to police because of how scared sex workers are of them. Because of this, it leaves sex workers dependent on pimps to protect them, but often just leads to more violence from someone who knows them better. One problem is that anti-prostitution laws violate prostitutes' civil rights, such as the right to work in a safe place, form unions, and travel. These laws prohibit brothels and force women to work on the streets instead of a safer environment. This makes reporting acts and violence very difficult because the complainants, the prostitutes, are considered to be a participant in the crime. Therefore, they aren't taken seriously by police. Additionally, according to Kimberly Kinger, a human rights advocate, 20% of cases that the police involve causes the woman to be further abused than if they didn't report it at all. An additional problem that we need to look at is the concerns for the health and well-being of sex workers. According to a 2015 report from the World AIDS Campaign website, the criminalization of prostitution increases women's vulnerability to contract HIV because they are less able to negotiate safe sex practices. Sex workers often do not have access to STI testing and HIV services. The reason for this are varied, but violence or fear of violence and discrimination play a major role in the issue of health safety. In the U.S., police have been known to confiscate condoms during routine sweeps in known sex work districts, which undermines public health outreach efforts for the U.S. that's trying to protect us. For example, in many cases, possession of condoms is used as evidence of intent to commit prostitution, and arrests can be made on this basis, discouraging sex workers from carrying condoms and looking out for their own health. Additionally, health services are often hostile to sex workers, subjecting them to disapproval, refusal to treat their health problems, and mandatory HIV testing. Exposure to their HIV testing and threatening to report them to authorities in several documented cases. The criminalization of prostitution also has many financial costs the federal government is suffering from. The federal government is not collecting income tax on fees paid to prostitutes. Not only is there a missed opportunity to generate tax revenue for the government, there is also a financial burden associated with the enforcement of prostitution laws and the amount of police and SWAT members used. According to the Deputy Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, the cost of the average U.S. city to enforce anti-prostitution laws is $7.5 million each year. In New York, for example, they spend $23 million each year enforcing these laws. On average, the cost for each arrest of a prostitute is $2,000. It is a rational thought to contemplate whether or not U.S. cities can keep up with the rising costs of keeping prostitution illegal. Furthermore, When examining the cost-benefit analysis of prostitution laws, it is clear that the criminalization of prostitution is costlier than other alternatives. The tax dollars that are spent on the enforcement of these laws could be better spent on preventing violent crimes or convicting violent criminals. Now that we have looked at the problems that are associated with the criminalization of prostitution, let's look at the best solutions for the decriminalization process. Decriminalization of prostitution is not a far-fetched idea, as many countries allow people to sell sex in a well-regulated way. In countries such as New Zealand, Switzerland, and many parts of Mexico, it is legal. It is about time for the U.S. government to think about the benefits that could happen from the decriminalization of prostitution. The definition of decriminalization of prostitution, according to the University of Rhode Island professor Donna Hughes, is the elimination of all laws and probation of the state and law enforcement officials from intervening in prostitution-related activities. The model of decriminalization was introduced and implemented in New Zealand in 2003, meaning that any legal citizen over the age of 18 can sell their services and not on the street. The sex workers' rights are guaranteed through employment and human rights legislation. In the 14 years since the induction of the PRA and the Prostitution Law Review Committee, they found carried out that 90% of sex workers believed that this gave them employment, legal and health, safer rights, and overall was more positive. Additionally, 64% found it easier to refuse clients, and 57% said police attitudes towards sex workers changed for the better. By keeping prostitution illegal in the U.S., it has created an environment which sex workers are subject to violence and harm. This is why Amnesty International, one of the most respected human rights organizations in the world, called for decriminalization of sex work in 2013. The organization came to the conclusion that decriminalizing sex work leads to an increased risk of human rights abuse against sex workers. This evidence also suggests that decriminalization could increase safety and decrease violence. The decriminalization of prostitution has caused sex workers to be pushed onto the street, leaving too many at the hands of pimps. If only the practice was decriminalized, sex workers could have more freedom to perform on their own terms in safe, legal, indoor working environments. It is estimated that if prostitution was decriminalized in the United States, the rape rate would be decreased by roughly 25,000, or a decrease in 25,000 rapes each year. This to me makes it clear that decriminalization of prostitution would be a much safer industry for women. Now that we have discussed the possible solutions of decriminalization, let's review the facts that were presented today. In conclusion, prostitution should be decriminalized in the U.S. for both social and economic reasons. As the world's oldest population, it is clear that prostitution is not going anywhere anytime soon. And even though it's currently illegal, it isn't stopping people from participating in the trade. There will always be people who will pay for sex, and there will always be women willing to do it. As anthropologist Patty Kelly said, prostitution has become a part of our culture in the United States. It is high time to decriminalize the part of American life. Like other morally controversial commerce, such as gambling, alcohol, and tobacco, prostitution deserves to be recognized also. Thanks.
That's really good.
Thanks.
Oh,